Section 6 of The Brain and the Voice in Speech and Song by F.W. Mott. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria James. Speech and right-handedness. The next step in cerebral localization was made by a French physician, Marc Dax, who first observed that disease of the left half of the cerebrum producing paralysis of the right half of the body, right hemiplegia, was associated with loss of articulate speech. This observation led to the establishment of a most important fact in connection with speech, viz., that right-handed people use their left cerebral hemisphere as the executive portion of the brain in speech. Subsequently, it was shown that when left-handed people were paralyzed on the left side by disease of the right hemisphere, they lost their powers of speech. But the great majority of people are born right-handed, consequently the right hand being especially the instrument of the mind in the majority of people. The left hemisphere is the leading hemisphere. And since probably specialization of function of the right hand, dexterity, has been so closely associated with that other instrument of the mind, the vocal instrument of articulate speech, the two have now become inseparable. For are not graphic signs and verbal signs intimately interwoven in the development of language and human intelligence? What has determined the predominance of the left hemisphere in speech? I can find no adequate anatomical explanation. There is no difference in weight of the two hemispheres in normal brains. Moreover, I am unable to subscribe to the opinion that there is any evidence to show that the left hemisphere receives a larger supply of blood than the right. Another theory advanced to explain localization of speech and right-handedness in the left hemisphere is that the heavier organs, lung and liver, being on the right side, have determined a mechanical advantage which has led to right-handedness in the great majority of people. This theory has, however, been disposed of by the fact that cases in which there has been a complete transposition of the viscera have not been left-handed in a larger proportion of cases. The great majority of people, modern and ancient, civilized and uncivilized, use the right hand by preference. Even graphic representations on the sun-baked clay records of Assyria, and the drawings on rocks, tusks, and horns of animals of the flint weapon men of prehistoric times show that man was then right-handed. There is a difference of opinion whether anthropoid apes use the right hand in preference to the left. Professor Cunningham, who made a special study of this subject, asserts that they use either hand indifferently. So also does the infant at first, and the idiot in a considerable number of cases. Then why should man, even primitive, have chosen the right hand as the instrument of the mind? Seeing that there is no apparent anatomical reason, we may ask ourselves the question, is it the result of an acquired useful habit to which anatomical conditions may subsequently have contributed as a coefficient? Primitive man depended largely upon gesture language, and the placing of the hand over the heart is universally understood to signify love and fidelity. Uneducated deaf-mutes, whose only means of communicating with their fellow men is by gestures, not only use this sign, but imply hatred also by holding the hand over the heart, accompanied by the sign of negation. Moreover, pointing to the heart, accompanied by a cry of pain or joy, would indicate respectively death of an enemy or friend. Again, primitive man protected himself from the weapons of his enemies by holding the shield in his left hand, thus covering the heart and leaving the right hand free to wield his spear. The question whether it would have been to his advantage to use either hand indifferently for spear and shield has been, to my mind, solved by the fact that in the long procession of ages evolution has determined right-handed specialization as being more advantageous to the progress of mankind than ambidexterity. Right-handedness is an inherited character in the same sense as the potential power of speech. Localization of speech centers in the brain. In 1863, Broca showed the importance in all right-handed people, that is, in about 95% of all human beings, of the third left frontal convolution for speech. When this is destroyed by disease, although the patient can understand what is said and can understand written and printed language, the power of articulate speech is lost. Motor aphasia. This portion of the brain is concerned with the revival of the motor images and has been termed by Dr. Bastian the glossokinesthetic center, or the cortical gray matter, in which the images of the sense of movement of the lips and tongue are formed. A destruction of a similar portion of the cortex in a right-handed person produces no loss of speech, but if the person is left-handed, there is aphasia because he, being left-handed, uses the third right inferior frontal convolution for speech. These facts have for long been accepted by most neurologists, but recently doubts have been cast upon this fundamental principle of cerebral localization by a most distinguished French neurologist, M. Marie. He has pointed out that a destructive lesion of the cortex may be accompanied by subcortical damage, which interrupts fibers coming from other parts of the brain connected with speech. In the study of speech defects, it is useful to employ a diagram. A certain part of the brain corresponds to the speech zone there indicated, and lesions injuring any part of this area in the left hemisphere cause speech defects. All neurologists, M. Marie included, admit this, and the whole question therefore is a destruction of certain limited regions of the superficial gray matter the cause of different forms of speech defects, or are they not due more to the destruction of subcortical systems of fibers which lie beneath this cortical speech zone? There is a certain portion of the speech zone which is assumed to be connected with the revival of written or printed language, and is called the visual word center. There is another region connected with the memory of spoken words, the auditory word center. You will observe that it is situated in the posterior third of the first temporal convolution, but this does not comprise nearly the whole of it, for there is an extensive surface of gray matter lying unseen within the fissure, called the transverse convolutions, or gyri. Lesions of either of these regions give rise to sensory aphasia, which means a loss of speech due to inability to revive in memory the articulate sounds which serve as verbal symbols, or the graphic signs which serve as visual symbols for language. Figure 17, diagram to illustrate the speech zone of the left hemisphere. Bastian. This scheme is used to explain the mechanism of speech, but probably the centers are not precisely limited as shown in the diagram. It serves, however, to explain disorders of speech. Destruction of the brain substance in front of the central fissure gives rise to what is termed motor aphasia and motor agraphia, because the patient no longer recalls the images of the movements necessary for expressing himself in articulate speech or by writing. Destructive lesions behind the central fissure may damage the portion of the brain connected with the mental perception of the sounds of articulate language, or the portion of the brain connected with the mental perception of language in the form of printed or written words. Sensory aphasia, the former entails inability to speak, the latter inability to read. This speech zone acts as a whole, and many disorders of speech may arise from destructive lesions within its limits. It has a special arterial supply, viz. The middle cerebral, which divides into two branches, an anterior, which supplies the motor portion, and a posterior, which supplies the posterior sensory portion. The anterior divides into two branches, and the posterior into three branches. Consequently, various limited portions of the speech zone may be deprived of blood supply by blocking of one of these branches. The speech zone of the left hemisphere directly controls the centers in the medulla oblongata that preside over articulation and phonation. Innervation currents are represented by the arrows coming from the higher to the lower centers. End of caption. These several cortical regions are connected by systems of subcortical fibers to two regions in front of the ascending frontal convolution, called respectively the glossokinesthetic, sense of movement of tongue, and chirokinesthetic, sense of movement of hand, centers. Now, a person may become hemiplegic and lose his speech owing either to the blood clotting in a diseased vessel or to detachment of a small clot from the heart, which, swept into the circulation, may plug one of the arteries of the brain. The arteries branch and supply different regions. Consequently, a limited portion of the great brain may undergo destruction, giving rise to certain localizing symptoms, according to the situation of the area which has been deprived of its blood supply. Upon the death of the patient, a correlation of the symptoms observed during life and the loss of brain substance found at the post-mortem examination has enabled neurologists to associate certain parts of the brain surface with certain functions. But M. Marie very rightly says, none of the older observations by Broca and others can be accepted because they were not examined by methods which would reveal the extent of the damage. The only cases which should be considered as scientifically reliable are those in which a careful examination by sections and microscopic investigation have determined how far subcortical structures and systems of fibers uniting various parts of the cortex in the speech zone have been damaged. Marie maintains that the speech zone cannot be separated into these several centers, and that destruction of Broca's convolution does not cause loss of speech. There are at present two camps, those who maintain the older views of precise cortical centers, and those who follow Marie and insist upon a revision. Herbert Spencer says that our intellectual operations are indeed mostly confined to the auditory feelings as integrated into words, and the visual feelings as integrated into ideas of objects, their relations, and their motions. Close quote. Stricker, by introspection and concentration of attention upon his own speech production, came to the conclusion that the primary revival of words was by the feeling of movements of the muscles of articulation. But there is a fallacy here, for the more the attention is concentrated upon any mental process, the more is the expressive side brought into prominence in consciousness. This can be explained by the fact that there is, in consequence of attention, an increased outflow of innervation currents to special lower executive centers, thence to the muscles, but every change of tension in the speech muscles is followed by reciprocal incoming impressions appertaining to the sense and feeling of the movement. The more intense the sense of movement, the greater will be the effect upon consciousness. In fact, a person who reads and thinks by articulating the words does so because experience has taught him that he can concentrate his attention more perfectly. Therefore his memory or understanding of the subject read or thought of will be increased. Very many people think and commit to memory by this method of concentrating attention. They probably do not belong to the quick, perceptive, imaginative class, but rather to those who have power of application and who have educated their minds by close, voluntary attention. Galton found a large proportion of the Fellows of the Royal Society were of this motor type. But the fact that certain individuals make use of this faculty more than others does not destroy the arguments in favor of the primary revival of words in the great majority of persons by a subconscious process in the auditory center, which is followed immediately by correlated revival of sensory motor images. Although the sensory motor images of speech can be revived, it is almost impossible without moving the hand to revive kinesthetic impressions concerned in writing a word. Both Ballet and Stricker admit this fact, and it tends to prove that the sense of hearing is the primary incitation to speech. Charcot, in reference to the interpretation of speech defects, divided persons into 4 classes: auditives, visuals, motors, and indifferents. There are really no separate classes, but only different kinds of word memory in different degrees of excellence as regards the first 3, and as regards the 4th, there is no one kind of memory developed to a preponderating degree. Bastian doubts the 2nd class, but does not deny that the visual type may exist, for Galton has undoubtedly shown that visual memory and power of recall of visual word images varies immensely in different individuals, and it is unquestionable that certain individuals possess the visualizing faculty to an extraordinary degree. Some few, moreover, can see mentally every word that is uttered. They give their attention to the visual symbolic equivalent and not to the auditory. Such persons may, as Ribot supposes, habitually think and represent objects by visual typographic images. Lord Macaulay and Sir James Paget were notable possessors of this visualizing faculty. The former is said to have been able to read a column of the Times and repeat it verbatim. The latter could deliver his lectures verbatim as he had written them. Both saw mentally the print, or manuscript, in front of them. Nevertheless, it is a question of degree how much motor images enter into silent thought and into the primary revival of words in different individuals. Mach, in Analysis of Sensations, says, "It is true that in my own case words, of which I think, reverberate loudly in my ear. Moreover, I have no doubt that thoughts may be directly excited by the ringing of a house bell, by the whistle of a locomotive, etc., that small children and even dogs understand words which they cannot repeat. Nevertheless, I have been convinced by Stricker that the ordinary and most familiar, though not the only possible way by which speech is comprehended, is really motor, and that we should be badly off if we were without it. I can cite corroborations of this view from my own experience. I frequently see strangers who are endeavoring to follow my remarks slightly moving their lips. Close quote. End of section 6.